Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Now, moving on to our next panel of the day. We're just waiting for Satya to join. Now, as we slowly emerge out of this pandemic, a new era of reinvention has begun, and inclusive leadership will be a key factor as we set our path for the future. So what does this mean, and what can we learn from our leaders? So next up is Lessons from the Top, and I'll now hand over to Satya Katara-Layton, Chief Executive Officer of Be Inclusive. Satya has led culture change and inclusion programs in some of the most challenging workplaces in the UK, including Ford Motor Company, the Royal Mail, and the British Army.
Hello. Hello, am I on? Can you hear me?
You're on.
Yes, you're on.
Hello.
Yes, you're on.
Hello, everybody. I was having a bit of technical problems just there. Good morning, everyone, and it's so lovely to have you all here at
Hello,
the
everybody. I was having a bit of
technical problems to our panel discussion. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Meenakshi, for your introduction. Agenda. I'm going to introduce our panel discussion, Lessons from the Top. But first, thank you, Meenakshi, for your introduction. I'm going to context for our discussion. As we know, Monday was International Women's Day, and it has become a huge global celebration of women and girls' achievement. And yes, there is much to celebrate. Women are achieving in every aspect of society, in the arts, education, politics, sports, and in the workplace. But after 45 years of equality legislation in the UK, there's still a long way to go before we can achieve true equality. Currently, we have more women than ever in the workplace, but unfortunately, the majority of them are in part-time, low-level, low-paid work. And last week, there was great celebration, and quite rightly so, because the FTSE 100 had achieved its target of achieving 33% women on their boards. However, most of those positions were non-executive directors. Women are still hugely underrepresented at executive level positions. For example, there are only 6 women CEOs in the FTSE 100 and only 5 in FTSE 250 companies. Despite women outperforming men in education, particularly at degree level, they're still underrepresented in science, engineering, and in technology. And numerous studies show that these are the very areas where more of the jobs of the future will be. After all this time, some of the fundamental issues such as flexible working, equal pay, sex discrimination, sexual harassment, job segregation, and childcare, all of which are huge barriers to women's engagement and progression in the workplace, are still far from being resolved. And despite the very hard work of many, many men and women, deep inequalities still remain in our society. And if you happen to be a Black or an ethnic minority woman, younger or older, disabled or LGBT, those inequalities are exacerbated further. And then the pandemic hit. And I won't repeat all of the issues because Meenakshi set them out really well in her opening remarks this morning. But suffice to say that women have been more adversely affected by the pandemic. And as we come out of the pandemic, we're all worried about our futures. We don't know what the future will hold. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And what will the new normal look like? The good news is that, more and more employers, leaders, and people of influence are seeing the social and economic benefits of diversity and equality. And they're working hard to address some of these issues. And I'm very pleased to say that we have 4 of those very people here with us this morning. And they're here to help us to unpick some of those issues and to talk to us about what they're doing in terms of advancing equality in the workplace, and also to share with us some of their plans for recovery out of the pandemic. So welcome, very, very welcome to our wonderful panel. Now I'm going to introduce them very briefly, but their full bios are available on the Hopin homepage. So if you haven't already done so, please go and have a look. They're well worth a read. First, we have Natasha Harrison. She's the Deputy Chair and Managing Partner of Boyce Schiller Flexner. She's a barrister, a solicitor, and she specialises in high-value complex disputes. Natasha was listed as one of the 100 most influential women in European finance in 2020. And she's been selected as the Heroes Woman Role Model of the Year for the second year running. Well done, Natasha. The Heroes is a list of women who are leading by example to drive gender equality in the workplace. Next, we have Ramin Press. He's a serial entrepreneur, investor, and technologist. He is the founder and managing partner of Human Capital Network. He's a board member of the World Economic Forum's Platform Economy and its COVID Response Alliance. He's also a member of the Male Champions of Change and a founder of Beautiful Minds, which fosters educational opportunities and for underserved communities. Silke Muenster is the Chief Diversity Officer of Philip Morris International. This is a new role created in 2020, reporting directly to the CEO. She's a coach and a mentor to other women and is known for being incredibly proactive on inclusion and diversity. And she has a degree in mathematics from Ruhr University. Next up, we have Marshal Andrew Turner, who is responsible for RAF strategy delivery, and he joined the Air Force in 1967. He has a master's in international relations and strategic studies, amongst others. He's a helicopter pilot, a paratrooper, has led numerous operational tours in some of the most dangerous parts of the world. He's a CBE, a rower, a rugby watcher, married with 2 sons, and by his own admission is a bad skier. I had to mention that, Andrew, because otherwise I just think you're Superman. So, welcome everybody to the panel. And I'm very pleased to say that we have a very gender balanced panel today, 2 men and 2 women, which is great, because women's inequality is not just a women's issue. We do need our male allies to help us cut through some of the stubborn inequalities that exist. So I wanted just to start by asking you all, what inspired you to work on the issue of gender inequality? And what was one of the first things that was most important to you to address right at the start? Can we go to Natasha first?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I think I was driven by very personal experience to embrace gender diversity in the workplace. I grew up in an environment and the law which was very, very male dominated. When I had my first child, I was the first woman in the firm to have a baby and be a partner. And I was met with confusion and at best and discrimination at worst. And it shocked me that in the noughties, it was 2005, there was still that level of confusion and discrimination. I was raised to believe that women could do anything. And at that point, I determined that I would never want anyone else to go through the kind of experiences I went through. And that's what determined my focus on really driving meaningful change in the workplace. And I was able to benefit from introducing all sorts of initiatives into my then firm. And we went from losing women to losing no women at all post-maternity leave to was a huge achievement. The other thing that drives me is I have a 15-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. I really don't want my daughter to ever experience what I and so many women have been forced to experience in the workplace, and that means taking responsibility for driving change. And I always say it's not just how we raise our girls, it's how we raise our boys. And I hope that my son, growing up with a working mother and being exposed to these types of conversations, will also be as responsible for driving change in the future.
Thank you. I mean, it's so interesting that sometimes our own experience is what we had to do. And I like this idea of confusion, people being confused to see you in the position that you were. It fascinates me still. And, we've come a long way, but that confusion sometimes still exists. Thank you, Natasha. Ramin, can I come to you next?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I think very similar. It's very much based on personal experience of different nature. For me, I think the realization of any kind of discrimination. In my particular case, it was at a very early age as a child, growing up in Germany, not looking 100% of what you expect back then a German to look like, coupled with dyslexia, which at the time when I grew up was at best certificate of some sort of idiocy, but far from any help being offered. And so, as a young child growing up, I struggled, and in hindsight, maybe for good, it made me who I am today in understanding and learning, that the differences that people have on the outset, if nurtured correctly, could actually turn into superpowers. And so, having grown up on the backdrop with, a mother who has been working flat out with my dad together as doctors, two older sisters, it's strange. The topic of diversity in gender is something I have not ever experienced. It's just I've been blind to it. And it only happened at a later stage throughout work, where I actually picked up on peers, colleagues, whether it was comments that were made, etc., that there was a difference. And I wanted to do everything I could in my power to ensure that, what I had grown up with as a worldview on equality, it should be wider spread.
Okay, wonderful. I love the idea of turning our differences into superpowers. I'd love to hear a bit more about that, Ramin. Thank you.
Oh, happy to.
Still okay? Can we come to you next?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Great to be here together with this fantastic panel today and with you, Satya. I think, of course, similar to Natasha, I think being a woman and studying mathematics like many, many years ago, you can imagine, I think still today, we know that we don't have too many women actually going in the field of STEM. I was one of the few, and this never changed through my career, because you are very often the only woman in the room, and that gives you a different sensitivity to the topic, I think, probably compared to male colleagues, because you go through all of these experiences. But I have to say, the reason why I'm so super passionate is because having been a market researcher for most of my life, and I've done research with consumers, talked to consumers all over the world, from Cape Town to Hong Kong, Tokyo, Western world. And what is so fascinating is that, there are very many differences, but the values of people and what motivates and drives people is so similar across the world. And I think this beauty of, the differences we all have and the common ground we share as human beings, I think this is clearly for me a fascinating topic and something which drives also our work with regards to inclusion and diversity. And different to Natasha, I have 3 sons. I managed to have the first female granddaughter last year, so I was very proud. And I have to admit, I bought pink dresses for her, but only once. I said, well, she's only a baby. And I can tell you that I can see the differences. The way my son is taking responsibility of children is very different from generations before, and I clearly see the influence we have as role models in private life and in business, for sure.
Wonderful, wonderful. And isn't it interesting that, our similarities are stronger than our differences, and our values, what people want from their lives, are all very similar, and it cuts across, social divides, racial divides, gender divides. Everybody wants very similar things in life, and it's great. Thank you, Silke. Andrew.
Yeah, so, well, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this really important conference and conversation today, which hopefully will extend beyond the morning. But the answer to your question, surely, Satya, is the reason why this is important is because it's absolutely overwhelmingly the right thing to do. Everybody matters everywhere, every day is this phrase I often use. And this, to pick up on Raman's point around, is much more than gender. It's about all the protected characteristics. But specifically on gender, I, as you said, I joined the Air Force in 1985. And at that point, women could not join as aircrew, as pilots. There were plenty of pilot women that came in from university with flying licenses and competencies and grit and determination and inherent cognitive lethality that were denied the opportunity because of historic Victorian structures. And, that's just not right. So that's what motivates me to put things right. But the real opportunity for me, as a leader in business now, is that because, and to slightly contrast 2 points, one you made, Satya, one Silke just made. You talked in one of your summing sessions after Raman spoke about superpower and also then about similarities and differences. The real value to me as a senior leader in the Royal Air Force is that we will generate far greater cognitive diversity by having different people, rising through, in our case, the ranks, the business structures. And if we don't have that cognitive differentiation, different brains, different points of reference, different cultures, different ethnicities, different genders, then we'll just make bad decisions. And in most people's worlds, that's a little bit like shareholders and bottom line. In my world, it's a bit more definitive and existential. So it is really important to me that we have great cognitive diversity, if you like, invisible diversity, because we get that from being men and women and LGBT and age and disability and other things which you can't necessarily see, in order to to sort of study problems more vigorously, more widely, bring different choices and options to the table, debate them more in a greater sense of challenge, hold them up to the light, prove that they work, and then as we would say, execute them. I'm sure that word doesn't translate easily into a commercial and civilian life. But we get after the choices we've made with tremendous vigor, and we need to make sure we're open-minded to the points of failure or imminence of failure. And that requires people to speak up and confront authority in different ways. So I guess the 2 points are, to answer your question, one is it's because it's overwhelmingly the right thing to do, to put right historic structures that are no longer fit for the 21st century. And secondly, because it helps me win. And winning's what my business is all about. Losing's bad.
Absolutely. Yeah, winning is good. I absolutely accept your points about, different cognitive diversity coming in, particularly into the workplace. I'm really interested, Andrew, because particularly in your area in your sector, in the RAF, I did some work with the Army, and it was said that actually people don't challenge or question what's going on. And I'm interested that you say that is actually what we're looking for. It's an interesting point.
Yeah, so let's very quickly on that. I mean, the Army, Navy, and the Royal Air Force are very different. Our cultures and histories are from different eras, and there's a necessity to the relationships between officers and soldiers, and officers and sailors, and officers and aviators in the Air Force. In our world, I have a critical dependency on the very youngest and the very most distant from my sight people. Critical dependency, because if they don't fix the wing on properly, or strap down the rotor blade bolts, they come off, and you end up the aircraft takes you to the scene of the crash. So in our world, this sort of intimacy of the relationship between the individuals in the business is absolutely vital, and it's one that is born on integrity, skills, and expertise. So I don't care who they are, but they really, really must do their job well. And I think if we can get better people by employing a more diverse workforce, because we can access the other 50% of the population, then we absolutely should do that. So I'm really struck by De Perez's book, Invisible Women, which I think is just a fantastic statement of the position that one might interpret. I mean, you might dispute some of the facts, but there's some compelling evidence and some fantastic referencing in that book, which I think is a must read for any senior rising leader.
Great, really interesting stuff. I just wanted to ask, because I'm moving on we have very short bit of time for us. Given that inequality is still here after so much legislation and so much work from leaders like yourself, does this come down to a leadership issue? And how important is that in organizations? Silke, can I come to you first on this?
Yes, I think we all know that everything which has to do with inclusion and diversity starts with the top. But I think something we pay particularly attention to is that we have leadership across the organization, across all levels. And I know in the panel discussion before, there was also this was also pointed out. I think there's a tendency today that companies fill their leadership, their females in leadership positions, they achieve their targets through having women in HR or legal, and there's nothing wrong about this. But if we truly believe that diversity will help us to make better decisions, then we have to make sure that we have women in roles where they have P&L responsibility and business decisions on a daily basis. And that's why we at PMI, we don't only look at overall targets, which are important, and we also have a target to achieve with regards to female representation, but we look specifically in individual markets and in individual functions at the percentage of females in decision-making bodies, because we think that this is clearly necessary to make sustainable change.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. More women, we need more women to get up through that pipeline, to get to those decision-making.
And in the right roles, not only in HR, as you know.
Absolutely. And that's the issue with job segregation, is that we have more women in HR. And I was reading, Natasha, that there's good representation in your sector with women at partner level. What would you say in terms of that question?
Well, I mean, just to pick up on that point, there isn't brilliant representation in the legal sector at partner level. You see a 50-50 entry from law school, sometimes even more women than men. But by the time it gets to partnership, which is at that critical time, when women are thinking about perhaps families and the like, there's a dip and it starts trailing off. And then when you get to the very senior restaurants, there are very, very few of them. I mean, I'm one of a tiny handful of women running a major law firm. I can count on one hand, which is appalling. But going back to your original question, legislation is obviously important, but I think culturally, the society and certainly leadership has traditionally taken the view that they'll do diversity because they have to, because, and we won't discriminate because we're not allowed to. And that's why this is a leadership question, because it's not about doing it because you have to or you might get sued. It's because, going back to Marshall Turner's point, it's about creating a truly diverse workforce and embracing it, celebrating it, not tolerating it. And to do that and succeed in that, first, it is a leadership question. It has to come from the top. And second, it's about not just ticking the boxes. It's about creating an environment in which people from all forms of diverse backgrounds can truly thrive. It's not about recruiting X number, it's about having an environment in which they can thrive. And that goes back to it being a question of leadership.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Ramin, can I come to you next?
Of course you can. You could see that I was already jumping.
You were ready there, waiting.
No, I just wanted to compliment what Natasha was saying in particular, and I think also Andrew in this regard is, I've been in a number of different environments, and I think it's not, and that I think is really, really important, is, whilst it's striking that we still even have to talk about it, which is shocking, we have to talk about it because not everybody embraces and thinks like we do and other people do. So there is still the need of awareness. But when we talk about what does it mean to be aware, is what happens behind closed doors, and is, not just the edict that comes down from senior executives or what you put in the vision statement and culture statement of an organization, but actually both female, male, irrespective of the rank or position or seniority in a company, that when behind closed doors jokes are made that are inappropriate, that people step up and actually say, this is not funny. This is beyond not funny. And if you don't accept that, then, I have to have a mechanism that I can report it. And it's only by doing that, and, you could give so many different analogies, that you will effectively start changing a culture, and it's the cultural change. A couple of years ago, people thought when you speak about culture, particularly in the context of digital transformation, that it was fluff. But it isn't. It is about the people, and it is about that culture. And I think it is, it goes beyond a company. It goes beyond an organization. It's a way of life. It's what you do when you are outside. It's how you behave. And we should all think that, some of those things are the early learnings of childhood that we must give our children as the future generation, but we equally must stand up and pick up for it in a company environment and not dismiss it.
Absolutely.
Patrick, can I just jump in on the point that Ramin made, if you don't mind?
Yes.
I think so I was going to interject when Natasha was speaking, because you said, Natasha, halfway, at some point women think about having children, but so do men. The trouble is that there's a provisioning for women in the workplace isn't adequate. And the reason why it's a leadership challenge is it's the business, the organization, that needs to put in place the structures to facilitate women to have children, the biological bits, but it's parenting is a two adult principle. It's much better to be raised with two adults. And then to Raman's point, you said the point I was going to jump in on, actually, which is, the word ethics comes from the word ethos, which is Greek, which means habit. If the leadership doesn't adopt a culture, a habit, a way of practice, a sort of form of the way it does its business, then it will not permeate the organization. And that's why the sense of how we look after women in the workplace to retain them, let them rejoin later after childbirth, should we say, is absolutely the C-suite's business. In fact, It's not even that, it's the chairman's business to ensure that the C-suite is adopting the right habits, the right ethics. And that's why I think gender equality and parity in the workplace is a deeply ethical position for a company to adopt.
I if I may, just very quickly. I mean, we I live in the UK, whilst I'm not there right now, but the small decisions that even my wife and I started thinking about when we have two boys, what school do they go to? Are we going, there was no question. It was going to have to be a co-ed school because we wanted the kids from the youngest moment on to be surrounded with, a normal habitat and not to end up in a mates culture, which is, purely men oriented, by which they're not learning, to learn with other sexes, irrespective of whether women learn faster than men. So my two boys are just going to have to deal with it and find their way around it. What I think is one of the greatest opportunities, and equally I am personally very worried about it if that opportunity isn't honest, is that throughout the COVID period, by which people have learned that you can work from almost anywhere, and I think people should also have learned that it should be output oriented and not desk time spent. That if, as a result of COVID, coming out of it eventually, we are forcing people back onto that, into the office in their desks, then we're losing the opportunity that actually allows for both men and women to do more of that parenting, to be closer to the kids. And I think that is probably something we should have all learned, with the right digital infrastructure and the willingness to trust the employees more, that they can organize themselves around it. And that would be tremendous.
Although I have to say, having just done 6 months of homeschooling, I've had quite enough parenting time for now.
Yeah, I say it's been hard for so many women. And you told us a story last time we spoke, Natasha, what your homeschooling experience was like. Just very briefly, can you share that with us? Because I think that our audience may like to hear it, because so many women are experiencing similar things, and you, in your position as a very successful business woman, has had exactly the same experiences. Very quickly, briefly, Natasha.
Well, there's only one word from it: is be absolutely hideous. I mean, trying to balance, a 10-year-old boy. My 15-year-old daughter apparently is doing what she's meant to do. Her report will tell me if that's true. But a 10-year-old boy who has dyslexia as well, with 8 hours online. And I'll be sitting there on conference calls with messages from the teacher saying, Max has disappeared. Max has no volume. Max can't see my and it was the stress of balancing it was extraordinary. And yeah, it was tough. And I worry that my children have suffered, ironically, more than children who don't have working mothers who can watch over them and are all over it, and he's been disadvantaged by that. So, but it's been really, really tough. And they went back on Monday, and I just realised quite how much pressure I've been under trying to do both. To actually be able to sit and work with people without doing schooling has been quite liberating.
Wonderful. Take my hat off to you and all working mothers who've had to do this through the pandemic. Really do. It's been tough. I just wanted to quickly pick up on a few things that have already been said. The issue around, sexual harassment in the workplace, whether it's low level or high level, is actually a real indictment to our organisations and our society. I've worked on this issue for many, many years, and it's something close to my heart because it really does make such a huge difference to women and the way that they can progress within organisations. And it isn't a leadership issue, because as Andrew and Ramin and Natasha and Silke said, if leaders don't set the culture or the tone of the culture, then it actually doesn't make that much of a difference. And I remember in one organisation that we had huge levels of sexual harassment, and we had to get our CEO and our chairman to make a video to say, if you don't do it at home, don't do it here. If you do it at home, don't do it here. Zero tolerance. We do not accept this. And it does make a difference. And I think as organisations, I always say, if you change a company, you can change a country, and it will take each company to do this in their own right. to then take that message out to society. And on the legislation piece, I think that legislation and what organisations do, particularly in terms of enabling women to work and work well and be parents as well, is that legislation and the processes and systems and organisations are all part of an ecosystem that keeps that inequality. And I think we really need to change the fundamentals of some of those. I'm very conscious of our time. This is a fascinating discussion. I've got so many other questions, but I've got questions coming also from our audience. I do want to get to talk a little bit about the pandemic, and because that is what we're facing now and into the future, next 3 to 4 years, 4 or 5 years. What are your plans? What are your organisations thinking about? What will the new normal look like for you guys? And what are you thinking about doing for the future? Can I go to Andrew first on this?
Yeah, so you were slightly weak there. So if I can just get the question right, it's sort of what do we do after the pandemic and how do we recover to business practices?
Yeah, organisation in terms of how will that be for you? How will the new ways of working be?
Yes, so I think when we spoke last, actually, I mentioned that on around about the 1st of April, I published some workplace guidances for how we might operate together. And we took advantage of the pandemic, if you like, to establish a completely new way of working that closed down late night, weekend email traffic, that prevented people from setting meetings early on Mondays, late on Fridays, that sought to do the administration around meetings in a much more brief and pithy way. And all of this has sort of changed the culture, actually. And I think psychologists told me that if you're in something new for 8 weeks, it becomes the norm and it's quite difficult to move back. Of course, now I'm thinking essentially as the COO of the Air Force, that there's a fiscal value to preventing that migration back to status quo ante, which is that I don't want the offices to be fully occupied again, because in the times prior to the pandemic, there was a big problem with those that couldn't come to work every day because of wider responsibilities, caring, family, other, and the problem became absenteeism. And so we've eradicated that, ironically, through this pandemic, because everybody's absent. They're in the work, but they're not in the workplace. And so our interest here is to try and secure some of these advantages, but in doing so, recognize that, like Natasha said, there are some serious challenges to being at home, not just as we've been through homeschooling, but mental health and other new joiners, leading teams when you've not met your staff and people. These are really difficult to do. And so we recognize there's a need for, should we say, a balanced mix of employment and workplace methods. So we started March the 23rd, 2020. We had 100% desk density. We moved quickly to 5%, essential operational, running operations people only in the headquarters. And I think we'll move back to somewhere between 30 to 40%. And we'll facilitate better, should we say, collaboration spaces, meeting rooms, IT. This means is unclassified, but we work at secret and above secret levels as well. So that's quite difficult to move around and to engage with. And so there's some significant IT related investments around cloud that we're already into. But I think the opportunity to work serve, as we'd say, but work in both ways will be an advantage to women, because some of the duties and responsibilities which unhelpfully but ordinarily fall to women, and I don't think they should, but they tend to, would accommodate that form of working style better. And I think that is just a very, very positive approach. So what we published in our sort of 10 practices, 10 principles, 10 processes document, that I think I told you before, that raced around the world, and I got back in Korean as it being translated in South Korea as a sort of good practice. Anyway, but the point is that the way in which that we want to retain that, we want to continue to work in an agile way, draw on technology and accommodate all people. So everybody matters everywhere, every day remains the core working principle. So I think actually, whilst it's been a dreadful shock and we'd never have wished it, the pandemic has allowed us to advance to a much more agile 21st century way of working that we want to hold on to. Not for everybody, not for all occasions, but for the majority, and for those for whom it works.
That's brilliant. So there's so many challenges, but still there's some positives that have come out of it. Thank you. Silke, can I come to you?
Sure. I completely agree, and I think Ramin also made the point before how important it is that coronavirus has given us the opportunity. It has clearly proven that this virtual ways of working works and that we can trust employees. And it gives us the opportunity to shape the way we work differently from what we had in the past. We did issue already last summer a new smart work policy, which means that we go for hybrid working. Again, not for everybody. There are people in the factories who will have to be physically present, but every role will be checked whether it's possible to go for hybrid work. So I think that is the one thing which we know is going to happen, and it will. We think that especially women can benefit from this. But besides this, everybody is thinking about what the new normal is, and we think it's really dangerous to make assumption, and that's why we have announced this week that we are embarking on a 1-year-long research project, which is called Inclusive Future, together with IMD Business School in Lausanne, where we look at what the status of inclusion is today and what has changed during the last year, also with regards to all of these issues like what does belonging mean if people only work virtually together, and importantly also how to measure this, and what the future will look like. And we will do this, of course, in dialogue with others. And we think that this is really important to do this research in order to drive meaningful change going forward.
That's great. I mean, you make an interesting point, because I was thinking, what happens, when you're working virtually, some or most of the time, what happens in terms of progression? What happens particularly in terms of women's progression if you're not working together and you're not able to promote yourself, or others are not able to see what you're doing? Those are great challenges in terms of, really making that change from getting women going up that the leadership ladder. Thank you. Natasha.
So we're never going to go back to the way we used to work. I think that's the starting point. And that is a good thing. It was not compatible with parenthood. And I agree again with Marshall Turner when he said that actually, working from home does have its advantages, homeschooling notwithstanding. You get to have that quality time with your family that you can't necessarily have if you're working full-time in an office. I've had breakfast, lunch and dinner with my children for the first time since they've been born. And for the most part, that's been wonderful. We've also learned that remote working can take place, and it can take place highly successfully. Indeed, it's more efficient in many respects. As someone who runs a firm that is majority based in the States, I've had more connection with the lawyers and the business support staff this last year via Zoom than I could possibly have face-to-face physically, given we're based in the sort of East Coast and the West Coast. It would just not be physically possible to be charging around the States like that. So there are really positive things we have to learn from it. And my vision is to take the best of what we learned from the pandemic in terms of working from home, flexibility, adaptability, again, trusting your employers, not thinking because they're at home they're not going to be working, on the contrary, and blending it with the best of actually office working, because I do think office working does have a place. It provides connectivity, it provides a glue, and certainly in the legal sector, it provides an opportunity for tutelage, training on the job, which you simply cannot replicate remotely. So it's a bit like having a blank piece of paper, starting again and thinking what's the best of both and creating a new way of working. And to me, that's a very exciting opportunity.
Yeah, great opportunity, absolutely. Thank you, Natasha. Ramin, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, and so I concur with pretty much all of the suggestions and approaches, so I don't have to add on top, but maybe to reflect that as a personal experience, and I'm by my own family being criticized for it, that whilst you work at home and all of a sudden Sunday, Monday, Friday, it's all the same, that you don't start, and I think also, for employers, that you don't forget the private life in between, because this can also very easily happen, that just because you're at home and, maybe assume that little bit of extra flexibility, that you don't overwork and you actually make a point of, taking some time out to be with your family. Because physical presence alone is not only what is required. So I'm sharing that because I apparently spent days on end without seeing the family, although
too much time on the internet, Rami.
Exactly. But I think the second part, and this is really important, and because I deal with an enormous amount of younger generations, entrepreneurs, we need to be mindful of the fact that whilst we have probably already had a career and we are very, very privileged that we were able to build a reputation and a network, that younger generations who are seeking for that moment of meeting their line manager at the fax machine or coffee machine or whatever, that doesn't exist. And it makes a group of people very, very fickle and uncertain about themselves of having that interaction. They don't have the network yet. They are relying of that contact, that praise, that not confront, that face-to-face of tell me what I want to know, but actually in a more slightly relaxed environment. And as that isn't given, we need to think of creating moments by which that can still occur.
Yeah, absolutely. A great challenge for younger people in particular, I think, all of this, because, particularly my niece, she's taken her first job through the pandemic. She just got a job about 6 months ago. And to this day, she has not met in person one single of her colleagues. And she finds that really challenging.
It's very
hard, very hard. We run out of time very, very quickly. I have some questions from the floor, if I may. So I've got to read them from here. So this question comes from Penny Catterick. And she says, as the first transgender woman director in Canadian engineering history, I understand equality from that perspective. Hurrah! Great. What I'd like to understand from the panel is what lies at the bottom of people persisting to be subconscious. We call it unconscious bias. Subconscious bias. Is it an addiction, she says? Who would like to try have a go at that question?
Can you just, I'm really sorry. I think it's a very interesting question, but I wanted to I didn't understand absolutely the last part.
It says, what I'd like to understand from the panel is what lies at the bottom of people persisting to be having subconscious bias. Is it an addiction?
If I may, I'll go on.
Sorry. I think it's a fear, and it's somewhat an installed image of the past that resides somewhere, and it's probably unconscious. What I would say, however, is, and I have to be honest, I have had situation where I shrug away and I go, I can't believe with everything I want to stand for that I just had that thought. But I think having that thought and being aware is the first step to then do something about it. And I think, we can't beat ourselves up too much if we live in an environment by which, I don't know if this is correct what I'm saying, or politically correct rather, but I never want to think whether or not I should have to question if I open the door for a lady. I think, that has got nothing to do with being sexist, or if I want to help someone carry something. So for me, there is this little divide where I think, being a gentleman or doing something which is a nice gesture should equally not be misinterpreted. And that is a very, very difficult, sometimes, place to be.
Great. Anybody else want to have a go at that? Thank you, Ramin.
But I think for sure, unconscious bias, I wouldn't agree that this is an addiction. And I think we have to be clear that that unconscious bias is happening to all of us. And as Ramin said, being aware is important, and you can't avoid. There is the way our brain works. To a certain extent, biases also help to make it more effective. That's the reason why we have a bias. But, in the last book from Adam Grant, where he explains this distance bias, that somebody who is only a floor below you already gets a lower performance rating just because the person is a floor away. That is something, when you're aware, you can do something about it, but it's not addiction from my point of view.
So very quick couple of points. In our world, we are in bunkers, and the lower down you are, the more important you are. So actually in our world, the lower the floor you are in the bed. But just 3 quick points. I mean, unconscious bias, it's laziness, full stop. It's laziness by the individuals to not understand, and it's laziness by the individuals around them. Because the second point is, this can be lanced at the very local level, and it's the easiest place to do it, to just pull people up, mention that there's been, it's probably not appropriate, the world's moved on, you're in a different era, and there is a different way. But Ramin's point is also true, I think, because what your point was, there are eggshells out there, and it's really difficult to know, exactly as you say, what is now not right and what is, still acceptable. So I think at its heart and its core, it's basically laziness by the individual and the people close to them.
Okay, great. May I go on to the next question? So Camilla Pontes asks, ensuring equal opportunities is also about understanding the difference between men and women and respecting these differences. What do you think these differences are, and how can we ensure that they are respected without making it difficult for women to advance? It's an interesting point, because I wanted to ask you all as well, is what's the difference between, men and women and the way that they lead? So anybody want to have a go at that question?
So the question is at its origin almost sexist, isn't it? Because it suggests there are macro differences between the two genders, which I would rather focus on the opportunities and the benefits from each side rather than demonstrate the differences. But my opening points, I think, are where I mean. So in our world, we have a physical domain, and we have a different sets of physical standards for women because they're physiologically and psychologically different to the frame and muscular structure. We had a problem with pelvic hip fractures because the pace length when you're marching, 32 inches, makes a female have to rotate her hips in order to stretch to reach the pace. So some really interesting physiological challenges because of their gender. It wasn't about women; it's just about small people. But women are generally, in an index Gaussian curve distribution, smaller. I think the benefit for me is that you bring different minds and different perspectives, and that's what we need to champion and value.
Okay, great, thank you. We have just a few minutes left. Anybody else want to have a go at that question?
Yeah, I think it's super dangerous, as you said, to point out differences between men and women. I'm 182 tall and I'm a mathematician, so that is by itself, I would probably be more a man than a woman. So because you tend to end up in generalization, and I think what I told my boys all the time is women can do everything men can do, but men can't have children. So I think that's the only difference I'm absolutely certain of, and everything else is probably a generalization.
Would you say men and women lead differently? Just very, very quickly, we only have a few minutes.
They eat differently.
They lead.
Yes, they do.
Yes, Natasha.
I think it's more about leadership style, but and maybe we're falling into stereotypes here. But I think they do have different approaches to leading, and I'm going to generalize terribly here, but I think there's sometimes a higher degree of empathy with women who are leading, or at least perceived empathy. I think women are perceived, and it's not accurate, to not be as strong leaders quite often. And I think women leaders still face a number of boundaries, actually, and prejudices in leading the way, because their assumptions they're not as strong as men and not as robust as men when it comes to leadership. I don't agree with any of that, but there are perceptions which I think and stereotypes in relation to leadership.
And if I may, just to jump on that, I mean, the UK Special Forces Air Component Commander is a female. She's absolutely not to be messed with. So, you know, we've got a load of really, really super cool women in leadership appointments across the Air Force. And, you know, they are as good, if not better, than their male counterparts. The difficulty is we don't have enough.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that some people say, oh, women can be more, you know, lead by consensus, want to, you know, work with people and all of this. But actually, you know, many of the women that I work with, not that they're taking on male attributes, but actually they're leaders because they're very clear about what they want and they don't compromise. And that's how they become leaders. I have one quick question. We've only got 2 minutes left and I don't want to leave it out. So Nikita Rees asks, how does gender interplay with race at leadership positions? It's a big question. And while holding leadership position, how do men and women move from awareness to action to ensure that gender equality is achieved? I think we've answered a lot of that question. Would you say? We've gone through a lot of the answers, most of what is asked.
But a roundup point is the point of intersectionality, because what you describe is an ethnic minority in the female gender in a leadership position. I mean, now we're in single decimals of a percentage point in leadership appointments. And I imagine, Natasha, none of your single-hand ladies are of an ethnic minority. I don't know, but I think it would be unlikely. So if you are that person, or if you're like that person, it's really difficult to see you at the top because there's nobody. And the only way we can get people to the top is by making the leadership appointments, C-suite and others, representative of society. You know, 50% women and 13% Black, Asian, and minor ethnic minorities. So, you know, that's the way we need to get at. But intersectionality is at the heart of that question, which is when you are more than one of these protected characteristics, that makes it really hard. If you've only got one leg, you're in a really small minority.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think we've come to the end of our session. I have enjoyed every moment of it. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, all of you. What we've learned is, you know, we've come a long way. We've had great champions in yourselves and others who are really working hard to make this move forward, to move the needle on women's equality in the workplace. And I applaud you all for it. Thank you very much for being part of our session today. What we've seen as we come out of the pandemic now is that there's been huge challenges. There are still huge challenges for many, many of us, but also there's lots of positives are going to come out of this. And hopefully, you know, more women will be able to do more jobs in different sectors and achieve much more than they have already. So thank you so much. And thank you for coming along. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.